The battlefield lay still, smoke curling through the cold night air. Blood pooled beneath Sergeant Daniel's trembling fingers. His breaths grew shallow, darkness creeping in. But as the world blurred, his K9 partner, Shadow, refused to let him slip away. The desert night stretched endlessly before him, a vast expanse of darkness punctuated only by the faint glow of distant fires and the rhythmic hum of an approaching helicopter. Sergeant Daniel Mercer lay motionless on the cold, blood-soaked earth, his breaths shallow, his body unwilling to move. The weight of exhaustion bore down on him like 1,000 unspoken regrets. His rifle, once an extension of himself, now lay forgotten beside him, its steel frame smeared with dust and blood. He had fought, bled, survived, but this time he wasn't sure he could. A low, urgent whimper broke through the silence, a familiar presence. Shadow. The German shepherd nudged Daniel's cheek, his warm breath contrasting against the deathly chill creeping into his limbs. The dog's ears twitched, his body taut, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain for threats. Shadow had always been his guardian, his unwavering companion through fire and ruin. But this wasn't just a mission, this was something more. Daniel tried to move his hand, reaching instinctively for Shadow's thick fur, but pain shot through his chest, stealing what little breath he had left. He sucked in a sharp gasp, feeling the warmth of his own blood seeping through his uniform. Damn, this was bad. The world blurred at the edges, memories surfacing like ghosts in the fog. Home. The wooden porch swing where his mother used to sit, humming softly as she watched the sun dip below the horizon. The sound of his father's voice, steady and grounding, reading aloud from a weathered book that smelled of old paper and ink. And then there was Claire. Her laughter, the way her fingers traced invisible patterns along his arm, the last letter she had sent him, tucked safely in his vest pocket. He had meant to write back, had meant to say so many things. Now it seemed he never would. Shadow let out a low, desperate whine, pressing his snout against Daniel's neck, unwilling to accept what was happening. The dog had been with him through the worst of it, the endless deployments, the deafening gunfire, the nights where sleep was a luxury neither of them could afford. Shadow had saved him more times than he could count, dragging him from the jaws of death when no one else could. And yet, Daniel had always believed that if it came down to it, he would be the one to protect Shadow, not the other way around. The darkness crept closer, whispering to him, beckoning. His grip loosened, his breathing slowed. Somewhere in the distance, the echo of a past life called to him. And then, something snapped. Shadow's body tensed, his ears pinning back. The dog's instincts flared. His soldier was slipping away and he wouldn't allow it. Not now, not ever. With a sudden burst of movement, Shadow bolted into the night, disappearing into the shadows, his mission clear. Find help. Bring him back. Even if it was impossible. Even if the world had already decided Sergeant Daniel Mercer was beyond saving. Somewhere, far beyond the suffocating grasp of pain, Daniel lingered between the present and the past. He was a boy again, chasing fireflies in the backyard, laughter ringing through the air. He was a teenager, gripping the steering wheel of his beat-up truck, the road stretching infinitely before him. He was a soldier, standing in a war zone, his boots heavy with the weight of every step. And then, he was here. Dying. A faint sound cut through the haze. Rapid footfalls, desperate panting, the distant rustling of movement. It wasn't human. It was faster, more urgent. Shadow. The German shepherd burst back into view, his paws kicking up dust as he skidded to a stop beside Daniel, his golden eyes wild with determination. He had been gone for only minutes, but in that time, something had shifted. Daniel tried to focus, tried to understand what was happening, but his body no longer obeyed him. His head lolled to the side, his vision swimming. And then, a voice, faint at first, but growing closer. "Jesus Christ, there!" "He's alive." The rush of footsteps, the blur of figures moving in the darkness, the sound of a radio crackling to life. Shadow had done the impossible. Daniel's eyes fluttered, his consciousness slipping in and out like waves retreating from the shore. Rough hands gripped his shoulders, voices overlapping in frantic urgency. "Stay with us, Mercer. He's lost too much blood." Shadow led us straight to him. This dog just saved his damn life. Darkness threatened to pull him under once more, but this time there was something anchoring him. A heartbeat, a presence, Shadow. Even as Daniel drifted, he felt it. The warmth of his dog pressed close, the steady rhythm of his breath. The world had tried to take him, had tried to end this story before it was ready to be finished. But Shadow had rewritten fate, and Daniel Mercer wasn't done just yet. The world shifted in and out of focus, a disorienting blur of movement and noise. Daniel's consciousness teetered between lucidity and oblivion. His body carried through the desert night on a stretcher, the rhythmic pounding of boots on sand a distant echo in his ears. The pain was unbearable, a raw fire searing through his chest. Yet the only thing he truly felt was Shadow's presence. His unwavering companion pacing beside him, refusing to leave his side, even as medics barked orders and assessed his wounds. "He's critical. We need to stabilize him now. Blood pressure's dropping fast. If we don't move, we're going to lose him." Through the chaos, a firm voice cut through the noise. "Keep that damn dog with him. I don't care about protocol. That K9 stays." A hand clamped onto Daniel's wrist, fingers pressing against his pulse. The medic's face swam into view, a pair of piercing green eyes scrutinizing him as if sheer will alone could keep him alive. "Sergeant Mercer, can you hear me?" Daniel wanted to answer, to give some indication that he was still here, still fighting, but his body refused to obey. His limbs felt like dead weight, his throat like sandpaper. Shadow let out a low growl, his stance protective as medics worked over Daniel's failing body. The dog's chest heaved, his ears pinned back, every muscle in his frame coiled with tension. He didn't trust these strangers, didn't understand why they were crowding his human, covering him in tubes and wires. Daniel had been the constant in Shadow's world, the anchor in the whirlwind of war. And now, something was wrong. Terribly wrong. As the helicopter blades roared overhead, kicking up clouds of dust and debris, Daniel was lifted into the aircraft. Shadow hesitated at the edge of the ramp, eyes darting between the men carrying his handler away. "Bring the dog," the commanding officer barked, cutting off any protest before it could begin. Without hesitation, Shadow leaped into the chopper, settling beside Daniel's stretcher, his wet nose pressed against his handler's limp hand. The aircraft lifted off, a violent lurch sending them soaring into the night. Daniel barely registered the movement. His mind was slipping again, fading into the past, drawn back to memories that had long haunted him. It was raining. Not the suffocating, dry heat of the desert, but the cool, steady patter of an autumn storm back home. He could hear the distant roll of thunder, smell the wet earth beneath his boots as he stood on Claire's front porch. She was crying. Her hands trembled as she held the letter he had written, words he had carefully constructed to sever what little hope still lingered between them. "You're really doing this?" Her voice was barely a whisper, breaking in the places where pain seeped through. "You're just walking away?" Daniel swallowed hard, his fingers tightening into fists. "You deserve someone who's actually here, Claire. Someone who isn't halfway across the world every time you need them." She shook her head, stepping closer, her blue eyes searching his for something, anything, that would tell her this wasn't real, that this wasn't happening. But Daniel had already made his choice. He had chosen duty. He had chosen war. He had chosen a life where love was a liability. Claire inhaled sharply, blinking back tears as she finally spoke. "Then go." The door closed between them, and just like that, she was gone. Daniel's eyes snapped open, the memory dissolving into the harsh fluorescent glow of a hospital ceiling. pain. His body screamed in protest as he sucked in a sharp breath, his vision swimming before locking onto the figure beside him. Shadow. The dog was curled at the foot of his hospital bed, ears perked the moment Daniel stirred. The moment their eyes met, Shadow lifted his head, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. A choked laugh, more air than sound, escaped Daniel's throat. "You never give up, do you, boy?" Shadow nudged his hand, warm and solid, grounding him in the present. The door creaked open. A woman in fatigues stepped in, her eyes sharp but kind. "You're lucky to be alive, Mercer." Daniel exhaled, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. "Yeah," he murmured, his fingers curling in Shadow's fur. "I had help." Days blurred into nights, time slipping through the cracks of Daniel's fractured reality. The sterile walls of the military hospital pressed in around him, a stark contrast to the endless expanse of desert he had known for so long. Every movement was a battle, every breath a reminder that he was still here. And Shadow. Shadow never left. The German shepherd remained stationed at his bedside, an immovable force in the chaos of Daniel's slow recovery. Nurses whispered about him, about the dog who refused food until his handler was awake, about the way he watched the door like a sentry, daring anyone to try and take him away. The military had rules about K9s, regulations that dictated when they should be retired, reassigned, or, God forbid, left behind. But none of those rules seemed to apply here, because everyone knew. Shadow hadn't just saved Daniel's life. He had brought him back. It was a quiet night when the doctor finally spoke the words Daniel had been waiting for. "You're stable enough to go home." Home. The word sat heavy on his tongue, foreign and unfamiliar. Home wasn't just a place, it was something else. Something he had lost. Something he wasn't sure he knew how to find. 1 week later, Daniel stepped off the plane, his body still aching, his mind still raw from the scars war had carved into him. Shadow trotted beside him, his ears perked as they moved through the quiet terminal. Unlike the battlefield, there were no explosions, no shouting, no desperate cries for survival. Just the sound of rain tapping against the glass windows, the distant hum of baggage carousels. And then... Daniel. His breath hitched. Claire stood a few feet away, her eyes wide, her hands trembling. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Shadow took the first step. Claire dropped to her knees, arms wrapping around the dog as tears spilled down her cheeks. Shadow let out a soft huff, pressing his nose against her shoulder, as if he, too, had been waiting for this moment. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had walked away from her once, and yet, here she was, still waiting, still here. The storm outside raged on, the sky a canvas of gray and silver. But for the first time in years, Daniel felt something settle inside him, something whole. The rain hadn't stopped. It followed them home, a steady rhythm against the truck's windshield, as Daniel drove through the quiet streets of his hometown. The town had changed, new buildings, unfamiliar storefronts, but some things remained the same. The old diner still had its neon sign flickering, the same rusty gas station still sat at the edge of town, and the road leading to Claire's house was just as he remembered, worn, winding, lined with towering oak trees that whispered in the wind. Shadow lay in the back seat, his head resting on his paws, eyes flickering open now and then to glance at Daniel. He knew his handler was tense. He could feel it in the air, in the way Daniel's hands gripped the wheel too tightly, in the way his breath came a little too fast, a little too uneven. Claire sat beside him, silent, her hands folded in her lap. He hadn't expected her to invite him home, hadn't expected her to still live in the same house, to look at him with eyes that held too many unspoken words. But she had. And now here they were, driving down a road that felt more like a ghost than a path forward. The truck slowed as they pulled into the driveway. The house was the same, small, with the same wraparound porch, the the same chipping paint on the railing. It smelled like pine and rain, like old memories too stubborn to fade. Shadow leaped out first, shaking the dampness from his fur before trotting up the steps as if he belonged here. Maybe he did. Claire hesitated at the door, her fingers brushing against the handle. Then, without a word, she pushed it open. Warmth, the scent of coffee, the quiet hum of a life he had once been a part of. Daniel stepped inside, feeling the weight of the past press against his chest. She set her keys on the counter and turned to face him. "You look like hell." A short laugh left him, dry and tired. "I've been through worse." Claire's gaze flickered to his bandaged side, the way he leaned against the doorway, as if standing for too long was too much. Shadow pressed against his leg, a silent pillar of support. "Sit," she said, moving toward the kitchen. "I'll make tea." Daniel didn't argue. He lowered himself onto the couch, exhaling sharply as pain rippled through his ribs. Shadow curled up beside him, head resting on his knee. Claire moved in practiced motions, filling the kettle, setting out 2 mismatched mugs. It felt normal, too normal. Like the last 7 years hadn't happened. Like he hadn't walked away. She set the mug in front of him and sat in the chair across from him, studying him the way she always had, like she could see straight through him. "I don't know why you're here," she said finally, "or why I let you in." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, the weight of exhaustion settling deep into his bones. "I don't know either." But he did. He had almost died. And in those moments, when the world had faded to nothing but pain and regret, he hadn't thought of war or duty. He had thought of her. Claire looked away, her fingers curling around the mug. "You left, Daniel. And you didn't just leave. You disappeared." Her voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the hurt beneath it. No calls. No letters. Just silence. Daniel swallowed hard. "I thought it was for the best." Her laugh was hollow. "For who?" He had no answer. Silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Then Claire exhaled, shaking her head. "Why now?" Daniel glanced down at Shadow, who was watching him, waiting. A soldier didn't need to be told when it was time to surrender. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to be anything but what I was made to be." Claire's eyes softened, just a fraction. "And what is that?" Daniel hesitated. Then quietly, "A soldier who doesn't know how to stop fighting." The storm raged on outside. Inside, for the first time in years, Daniel felt something shift. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to fight alone. The clock on the wall ticked softly, a steady beat against the silence. Claire's gaze held his, unwavering, searching. He had never been good at this, at speaking when words felt too heavy, at unraveling the knots in his chest long enough to make sense of them. But she had always seen past the walls, and now he could feel them cracking. "You don't have to be just one thing, Daniel," she said softly. "You don't have to be just a soldier." He wanted to believe that, but he didn't know how. His life had been built on rules, on orders, on the certainty of knowing what needed to be done. But war had no place here. There were no maps, no battle plans, no clear enemy to fight. Here, there was only uncertainty, and uncertainty terrified him. Shadow stirred beside him, letting out a quiet sigh. His warm presence was a reminder that he had made it back, that he was still here. "I don't know how to be anything else," Daniel admitted. Claire tilted her head, studying him. "Do you want to be?" The question struck something deep inside him. He thought about the battlefield, about the smell of blood and sand, about the silence that followed when everything was over. He thought about the way he had trained himself to feel nothing, to compartmentalize, to shove everything down until it didn't exist anymore. And he thought about the moment he had almost died, about the regret, the ache, the knowledge that he had wasted years running from something he had never truly wanted to leave behind. Yes, he wanted to be more than this, more than a broken soldier with nothing left but a loyal dog and a handful of memories. He wanted something real, but wanting something and knowing how to have it were two different things. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice quiet, raw. Claire's lips parted, as if she had 1,000 things to say, but in the end, she just reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "You start by staying," she whispered. Daniel exhaled. Staying. Not running. Not hiding behind duty or war or the endless ache of what-ifs. Just staying. Shadow let out a quiet huff, pressing closer. Daniel glanced down at him, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. Maybe it wouldn't be easy. Maybe it would take time. But for the first time in years, Daniel wasn't thinking about the next mission, the next deployment, the next fight. For the first time, he was thinking about something else, something worth fighting for. He met Claire's gaze, his fingers tightening around hers. "Okay," he murmured. "I'll stay." And just like that, the war inside him quieted. The house was quiet long after Claire had gone to bed. Daniel sat on the back porch, his body stiff from the weight of old wounds, some physical, some carved into him by years of war, regret, and ghosts he couldn't name. The night air was thick with the scent of wet earth, the remnants of the storm lingering like an unspoken memory. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, tapping softly against the wooden railing. Shadow lay at his feet, ears perked, watching his every movement as if sensing the war still raging inside him. Daniel tilted his head back, staring at the dark sky. He should have been dead. By all logic, he should have bled out in the desert, his body swallowed by the endless sands of a battlefield that had long since lost its meaning. But Shadow hadn't let him go. That damned dog had run through hell to bring him back. And now what? He had spent years training himself to live in war, to find purpose in the mission, in the structure of orders and objectives. There had always been a next deployment, a next battle, a reason to keep moving. But here, back in this quiet town, in Claire's home, there was nothing to fight. No orders, no mission. Just silence. And silence was dangerous. Because in silence, the ghosts spoke. They whispered in the rustling leaves, in the wind curling through the trees, in the creaking floorboards of an old house that smelled too much like home. He could see them now, in the spaces between shadows. Sammy, the kid who had bled out in his arms during his first tour, whispering for his mother in a language he hadn't spoken since he was 5. Torres, who had taken a bullet meant for him, grinning through the blood on his lips, telling Daniel to make it count. Jameson, the only man who had ever been able to make him laugh in the middle of hell, the guy who had promised they'd get drinks back home but never made it past the last ambush. They were all here. And the worst part? They had stayed with him. They had followed him back while he tried to pretend he could outrun them. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, his fingers pressing against his temples as if he could will them away. "I should have gone with you," he muttered to the darkness. Shadow let out a quiet whimper, nudging his knee. Daniel exhaled, his breath shaky. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Shadow didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The dog had never needed words to understand. For years, Shadow had seen him at his worst, on the battlefield, in the wreckage of their missions, in the endless nights where sleep was a luxury neither of them could afford. Shadow had never let him drown in it. Not then. Not now. Daniel rubbed his face, the roughness of his calloused hands grounding him, forcing him back into the present. This wasn't war. He wasn't dying. And maybe, just maybe, he had been given this second chance for a reason. The ghosts didn't answer, but for the first time in years, they didn't feel quite so heavy. Daniel inhaled deeply, letting the night settle around him. Maybe he didn't have all the answers. Maybe the wounds wouldn't heal overnight. But as Shadow pressed closer, and as the warmth of Claire's home lingered behind him, he realized something. He was still here, And for now, that was enough. The morning came slowly, creeping over the horizon in shades of muted gold and soft gray. Daniel sat on the porch, his fingers curled around a steaming mug of coffee, shadow stretched at his feet. The world was still, the storm long gone, but something inside him still churned like unsettled water. He wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there when Claire appeared in the doorway. "You slept out here?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Daniel shrugged, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Didn't sleep much." Claire stepped forward, leaning against the railing beside him. She didn't speak right away, just let the quiet stretch between them. Eventually, she nodded toward Shadow. "He stayed with you all night." Daniel glanced down, running his fingers through the thick fur on the dog's back. "He always does." Claire shifted slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. "You look different," she murmured. "Not just the scars, it's something else." Daniel didn't respond. He wasn't sure what she meant, if he was different, if war had stripped him down to something unrecognizable. Claire sighed. "I don't know how to talk to you, Daniel. I don't know if you're the same man I knew before." Daniel set his mug down, his throat tight. "I don't know either." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "So what happens now?" The question lingered, heavy in the air. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I don't know how to be here, Claire. I don't know what life looks like when there's no war to go back to." Claire's expression didn't change, but there was something behind her eyes, something knowing. "Then you need to figure that out." Daniel frowned. "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." Claire's voice was firm, cutting through his uncertainty. "You don't get to use war as an excuse forever. You don't get to just exist in survival mode because it's easier than facing everything else." Daniel flinched, his grip tightening around his mug. Claire exhaled, softer this time. "I'm not saying it's easy, but you're here, Daniel. You fought to stay alive. That means something." He wanted to believe that. God, he wanted to. But the weight of everything still pressed down on him, like chains wrapped around his ribs, keeping him tethered to a world he didn't know how to leave behind. Before he could respond, Shadow's ears perked. A low growl rumbled in his chest, his body shifting as his eyes locked onto the road. Daniel followed his gaze, and immediately stiffened. A black SUV was pulling up the driveway, moving slow, deliberate. Daniel was on his feet in an instant, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Shadow was already in position, his body tense, ready. Claire frowned. "Who the hell is that?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't know. But something in his gut told him that whatever was coming, it wasn't good. The SUV rolled to a stop, the engine idling. Daniel's hands curled into fists as the doors opened, and 3 men stepped out. They weren't dressed like law enforcement. Their movements were too smooth, too practiced. Something about them felt wrong. Daniel didn't move as the tallest of the men stepped forward, his sharp gaze flickering over him, then to Claire. "You Mercer?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The way the man smirked told him that he already knew the answer. Shadow let out another growl, his muscles coiled, waiting for a command. The man chuckled. "Relax. No need for the theatrics." He glanced toward Claire. "Pretty place you've got here." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're trespassing." The man ignored the warning. "We were looking for you, Sergeant." Daniel's fingers twitched at the use of his title. The man tilted his head. "You made quite a name for yourself overseas. There are people who'd love to have you on their side." Daniel's muscles coiled. He had heard this before. The promises, the offers, the quiet threats disguised as opportunities. "I'm not interested," he said flatly. The man smirked. "Didn't think you would be. But the thing is..." He stepped closer, his expression hardening. "People don't just walk away from this kind of life." Daniel's breath slowed. The air between them thickened. A test. This was a test. The man wanted to see if Daniel would break, if there was still a soldier inside him, waiting for a reason to fight. But Daniel had nothing left to give, and he sure as hell wasn't going back. The man studied him for a long moment, then exhaled, shaking his head. That's a shame. He turned, motioning for his men to follow. But just before he stepped back into the SUV, he glanced at Claire. Be careful who you trust, Sergeant. A slow, knowing smile. People have a way of getting hurt when they think they're safe. Daniel's blood ran cold. The SUV pulled away, disappearing down the road. For a long moment, neither he nor Claire moved. Then, Daniel? Claire's voice was steady, but he could hear the undercurrent of fear beneath it. Daniel turned to her, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. I need to leave. Claire's face paled. What? Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his pulse hammering against his skull. This isn't over. His voice was low, controlled. They'll come back, and I won't let them drag you into this. Claire's eyes darkened. So you're just gonna run again? This isn't running. Bullshit. She took a step closer, her chest rising and falling with sharp, uneven breaths. You're scared, Daniel, and I get it. But leaving? That's not the answer. His hands curled into fists. I can't let them hurt you, Claire. Claire exhaled sharply, shaking her head. You think leaving is going to stop that? You think disappearing is going to make this all go away? Daniel stared at her. She was right. She had always been right. Running hadn't saved him before. It wouldn't save him now. He looked down at Shadow. The dog's golden eyes locked onto his, unwavering, waiting, trusting, just like he always had. Daniel exhaled. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't a runaway, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let fear decide for him. He turned back to Claire, his voice steady. Then I fight. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. And for the first time in years, Daniel Mercer stood his ground. Because this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows as Daniel sat on the edge of Claire's porch, staring down the road where the black SUV had disappeared. Shadow sat beside him, his ears twitching at every distant sound, ever the sentinel. The quiet should have been comforting, but Daniel had learned long ago that silence was just the calm before the storm. Inside the house, Claire moved through the kitchen with forced ease, the tension in her shoulders betraying her calm expression. She wasn't asking him to stay anymore. She wasn't begging him to stop running, because he had already made his choice. He was staying, not just to protect her, but to stand his ground, to fight for something other than war. Claire finally stepped outside, a warm mug in her hands. She handed it to him without a word, sitting beside him on the porch steps. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on them, but neither of them broke the silence. Not yet. Daniel took a slow sip of the coffee, letting the heat settle inside him. They'll come back, Claire finally said, her voice quiet but steady. Daniel nodded. I know. And you're not leaving. Another nod. No. Claire exhaled, pulling her knees up to her chest. Good. That was all she said. No anger, no hesitation, just that simple word. Good. Because she believed in him. Maybe she always had. Shadow huffed, shifting slightly, but he didn't relax. He could sense it, the way the storm still loomed on the horizon, waiting. Daniel sighed, setting his mug down beside him. I need to be ready, he said. They're testing me. If I don't handle this the right way, it won't just be me in danger. It'll be you, and I won't let that happen. Claire was quiet for a moment before she spoke. Then what do we do? Not you. We. She wasn't running either. Daniel looked at her, studying the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes. The woman he had left all those years ago wasn't waiting to be saved. She had already decided to fight, just like him. We make them think I'm not worth their time, Daniel said finally. I cut ties. Make it clear I have nothing to offer them. Claire raised an eyebrow. "And you think that's going to work?" Daniel exhaled. "No." She let out a humorless laugh. "Great plan." Daniel smirked slightly. "I didn't say it was a perfect plan." Claire shook her head, but there was no real frustration in her expression, just quiet understanding. "So what's the real plan?" Daniel's fingers ran over Shadow's fur absent-mindedly. "We prepare, we stay ahead of them, and when they come back," his voice hardened, "we make sure they regret it." Claire studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right." Just like that. No more arguments, no more pushing him away. They were in this together. The days passed in a slow, tense rhythm. Daniel worked. He fixed the fence, repaired the back porch, helped Claire with small tasks around the house. At first, it felt strange, moving through life as if he belonged in it again. But little by little, the weight in his chest lessened. Shadow never left his side, always watching, always waiting. And Claire. Claire was still Claire. She didn't push him to talk. She didn't ask him for promises he wasn't ready to make. She just was, and maybe that was what he needed most. Then, one night, it happened. The SUV returned. Daniel had been expecting it. He was already sitting on the porch when the vehicle rolled to a stop. Shadow tensed beside him, but Daniel kept a firm hand on his back. This time, only the man from before stepped out. No backup, no show of force, a different kind of tactic. Daniel didn't move as the man approached, hands tucked into his coat pockets. "Nice place," the man said. "You ever think about how easy it would be to lose it?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "You ever think about how easy it would be for you to disappear?" The man smirked, as if amused. "Not bad, Mercer. You still got that fight in you." He tilted his head. "So why waste it?" Daniel didn't answer. The man sighed, feigning disappointment. "Look, I get it. You think you're done. But we both know the world doesn't work like that." Daniel finally stood, his movements slow, deliberate. Shadow rose with him, his presence a silent warning. "You're wasting your time," Daniel said. "I'm done. Find someone else." The man chuckled. "You say that now." Daniel stepped forward, his voice lowering to something dark, something edged. "I mean it." The air shifted. The easy confidence in the man's posture faltered just slightly. Daniel saw it, and he pressed harder. "You came here thinking I'd be scared," he said. "Thinking I'd fall back in line, but you got it wrong." The man's smirk faded. Daniel took another step forward. "You should walk away," he said, his voice cold. "Because if you ever come back here, if you ever look at her the wrong way..." His eyes darkened. "I won't just be a problem. I'll be your worst nightmare." The man stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right, Mercer." He backed away, returning to his SUV. "You made your choice." The door shut. The engine rumbled. Then, just like that, they were gone. For now. Daniel stood there for a long time, staring down the road. Shadow let out a slow breath, finally relaxing. Claire stepped onto the porch, watching him carefully. "Did it work?" Daniel exhaled. "Maybe." She crossed her arms. "And if it didn't?" Daniel turned to her. Then he reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Then we keep fighting," he said simply. And for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. Some battles are fought with weapons. Others are fought with the will to keep going, to stand, even when the world tells you to kneel. Sergeant Daniel Mercer learned that war doesn't always end on the battlefield. Sometimes the hardest fight is learning how to live again. What would you do if given a second chance? Would you face your demons, or would you run? Tell us in the comments below, and if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones that remind us we're never truly alone.